I'm Murray Hancock, convener of the Brisbane Dialogues in transition to Australian Dialogues. And I thought it was about time that I got up here, 6 years since our beginnings, mainly to say thank you to as many people as I can in these few moments, instead of just providing lists to other MCs for people to thank. I'd like to start with the current custodians of the beautiful place in which we meet, the owners of the Princess and the Tivoli, especially Dave and Steve Sleswick and their team, without whom we would certainly not be here. And it's actually a bit, yeah. And it's actually a bit hard to imagine where else we might be, if anywhere, actually. In addition to being incredibly supportive of the dialogues, they're very resourceful and flexible and can host almost any kind of event, large or small. Please try them next time you have a special occasion and mention the dialogues. They're worthy successors to the traditional custodians of the place we call Woolloongabba. It's customary for the MC on these occasions to acknowledge on behalf of all present the traditional custodians by referring to a principle or element of dialogue in Aboriginal culture. Our advisors have identified about 10 very resonant ones, but I often come back to the very first principle: gather around the campfire or under a shady tree. That is, in a congenial, comfortable place, creating a positive atmosphere for difficult or complex conversations. Well, here we are. Intriguingly, according to the modern oracle Wikipedia, one of the possible meanings of the name Woolloongabba is fight, talk, place. I doubt if anybody now knows what this means. Was it a place people came for fighting talk, or talk to avoid fighting, or talking and fighting? In any case, I like to think of it as an early example of the human use of language and custom replacing violence. I'll refrain from relating this to recent events or making deep, meaningful observations about evolution and civilization. I'm sure the relevance to what we're here for tonight is not lost on everybody in this audience. Now to some other thank yous and acknowledgements. I can't name everybody, but there are many. Most importantly, our speakers tonight, all very busy people who are contributing their time and expertise, and almost all of whom have travelled interstate to be here. To Nashara Lyons and the events team, who've made it all happen, all of the on-the-day volunteers, our very lean, long-standing committee, and now our esteemed advisory panel, particularly Peter Varghese, not only for speaking tonight, but for being the prime mover in putting the panel together earlier this year. It's already made a material difference in what we can do. There's a small group of ongoing financial supporters. They know who they are. Minter Ellison, who are rolling up their sleeves pro bono again to guide us through the conversion of our legal entity. UQ Liveris Academy, apologies, which supports Dialogues events financially in other growing ways. Plus, buyers of premium tickets, and especially the conveners' tables, buyers, Ernst & Young Queensland ×2 tables, and Simon Fenwick, absent tonight, as these are what make the big Dialogue financial model workable, and which is crucial to our plan to propagate them nationally. And they underpin our very inclusive pricing policy and make it possible to sustain everybody with food for the long-form discussion. Very important. And vitally, for the future of the dialogues, a small but growing band of champions around the country who really get the value of what we're doing and are willing and able to lead efforts by their or other organisations to help replicate this unique format or something close enough to it. And finally, thank you everyone else here for your interest in making the effort to come along. After all the work that goes into producing one of these events, it is gratifying to have a good crowd. This brings me to the inevitable short plug for the dialogues, if I haven't done it enough yet, especially but not only for first-time guests. we are the first dedicated civil discourse or bridging organisation in the country, with the ultimate mission to support other organisations to conduct across-the-aisle discussions on big ideas and issues, especially contentious ones. We're entirely independent, neutral, non-partisan, volunteer-based community organisation, and we aspire to being intergenerational and inclusive. Big dialogue events have now been held also in Sydney, Melbourne twice now, and Canberra, and there's a growing pipeline as other organisations emerge to collaborate. Think tanks, learned academies, professional associations, residential colleges and other university units, and other kinds emerging. Also, there are already at least half a dozen probable or highly probable public dialogues in the pipeline for next year, with dozens of other possibles, with the numbers growing every week. Remains to be seen how strong event commitments and delivery are, but the picture is very reaffirming and encouraging. So, moving on to the Brisbane Rule, created at the launch of the dialogues, always bears repeating. It's a variation of the Chatham House Rule, which many will know, adapted for public events in the digital age. So, all participants, which includes the audience as well as the speakers, agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on characters, before, during, and afterwards, online as well as offline. A few housekeeping points. Please turn mobile phones off or put them on silent, please. Fire exits are clearly marked, and in that event, please follow staff instructions. Toilets are through that side there. Feel free to move around unobtrusively as possible during the discussion if you want to go to the loo or the bar. And if you've not noticed yet, one of our panellists, Cheng Lei's book, A Memoir of Freedom, is for sale at the back side over there, courtesy of local bookseller Quick Brown Fox, and I believe she'll be signing copies after the stage discussion ends for half an hour or so. Before introducing the speakers, I'd like to encourage everybody to text questions to the number on the screen, which I won't, well, I'll read out, but just as a cross-check, 0499019001, and that'll cycle on the screen. If you miss it, it'll come back. Succinct, that means short. Relevant questions with names given may be used later. There'll be time for a limited number of live questions from the floor also. So now to introduce the speakers. First we have Peter Varghese, aforementioned, AO, Chancellor of University of Queensland, newly chair of Australian Public Policy Institute, API, chair of AsiaLink Council, and perhaps I won't embarrass him by reading the full list, but there are quite a few more things. Mainly, of course, in tonight's context, he is a former Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, following many other senior diplomatic and service positions. Secondly, Cheng Lei, also aforementioned, presenter and columnist at Sky News Australia. Please be seated. Recipient of the 2024 Australian Press Council Press Freedom Award and author of A Memoir of Freedom, on sale here tonight, if you didn't hear me before. She was formerly business anchor on the state-owned television channel in Beijing, CGTN, and before that, CNBC's China correspondent. Third onto the stage is Professor James Laurenceson, Director of the Australia China Relations Institute, ACRI, University of Technology, Sydney, Australia's first and only research institute devoted to studying the relationship between the two countries. And last but not least, our moderator, Joanna Hewitt, AO. Board Director at the Lowy Institute, Australia's representative on the APEC Vision Group, and a former Australian ambassador, departmental secretary and lead WTO negotiator, amongst other public service positions. Please join me in welcoming all the speakers to the stage. Over to you, Joanna.
Thanks very much, Murray. Are we switched on? I'm not sure. Do you hear me? Yes? Great. Okay. It's lovely to be here, and thanks all for coming. I'm sitting here in this, what feels like a Victorian drawing room setting for some kind of comedy or murder mystery. But I think really we have more serious things to get to this evening. But it is a lovely spot and marvellous to be here with you all. So the theme of the subject, as you know, it makes an attempt to sort of revisit the Australia-China relationship 5 years on from the last time the Brisbane dialogue tackled this subject. Some of you may have been there at the time. Tonight, though, we're going to the heart of that perennial theme that has been at the centre of Australian foreign policy for some decades, that of having the United States as our closest security ally and critical security partner, and China, with its very different state party setup, social control, and a quite different economic system from the Western model, as our major economic partner. Australian governments have trod that path fairly successfully, managing the duality in this situation with both the US and China ever since the recognition of the People's Republic in 1972. Not without bumps and blips along the way in relations with China. There was a particularly low point around the time Brisbane Dialogues tackled this subject 5 years ago, 2020. You'll recall the very sharp cooling in the relationship, China's 14 demands for adjustments Australia needed to make in policy, and the imposition of trade sanctions. The relationship is now steadied. Some advocate taking more active steps to strengthen further our engagement with China at this time. Others argue for more cautious dealings with a more assertive nationalist and more militarized China. I think today we find ourselves at an inflection point in a fractured world, with lots of international norms and expectations fraying, and much edgier competition between China and a less predictable United States, more inwardly focused. More suddenly, perhaps, than most of us had expected, the transition in power between China and the United States has accelerated, and the balancing of our security and our economic interests, that duality in our policy settings, looks like a trickier path to tread. Well, I think we're well placed with tonight's panel to dig into what lies behind the dizzying pace of change in the world around us, what it might mean for our interests and the choices we might have to make to safeguard our national security and prosperity. As you've heard, we'll start the evening by asking each of the panelists to themselves speak for a couple of minutes, 2-3 minutes, on the broad themes that we've set for the evening. And after that, between us in the panel here, we'll dig into the detail and tease the issues out before we get on to the Q&A and a wrap-up commentary from each of the panelists. But let's move on straight away. Peter, can we start at your end of the setup for your first introductory thoughts on the subject?
Well, thank you very much, Joanna, and good evening to everyone. And let me at the outset thank Murray for the invitation to be here and to acknowledge the great work that he's put into building up the Brisbane, now the Australian dialogues, and promoting the idea that you can have robust debate, but it can be civil. And I think there's never been a more important time to emphasize that disagreeing agreeably is a key part of moving forward. So I'm a recovering policy advisor, and that experience has broadly shaped the way that I think about the Australia-China relationship. The meta challenge, in my view, with Australia and China is relatively straightforward to articulate, but rather complicated to implement. And that is, how do you maximize Australia's economic opportunities while minimizing our strategic risk as we build up our relationship with China? And that leads me to a framework which I would broadly describe as engaging and constraining China, and each has to be pursued at the same time. Now, the case for engaging China, I think, is pretty obvious. We can't shut our eyes and hope that China will go away. China is already, depending on which measure you use, either the largest economy in the world or the second largest economy in the world. It is our largest trading partner by a very significant margin. It has been a contributor over many years now to Australia's standard of living, and it will be a key shaper of the geopolitical environment in the Indo-Pacific, which is the region of most importance for Australia. So engaging such an entity is clearly important, unavoidable, and in Australia's interests. However, I don't think it's possible to rest China policy on a hope for the best engagement strategy, because we also do need to recognize that China's strategic ambitions, broad strategic ambitions, are problematic for Australia. It's important, I think, to be quite careful as to how we describe China as a strategic challenge, because we're not, in my view, dealing here with an enemy who has designs on our territory in the way that people sometimes like to think about strategic challenges. Rather, our concern about China's strategic ambition is that it seeks to be the hegemon of the region. It seeks to be the hegemon of the Indo-Pacific. In some ways, it seeks to recreate the old Middle Kingdom, where harmony was hierarchy, China sat at the top of the hierarchy, and other states were expected to unilaterally concede the primacy of China's interests. Now, the reason why a Chinese hegemony is problematic for Australia fundamentally goes to the character of the Chinese political system. In other words, a concern we would have that a one-party Leninist authoritarian system would become the preeminent power in our region and therefore shape the strategic culture of the region. And Australia is a country that can only operate, in my view, at the intersection of interests and values. I don't think it's open to Australia to pursue interests irrespective of values, and obviously our defense of values needs to take close account of our interests. So for that reason, we will, in my view, always have a desire to balance China geopolitically and strategically in order to constrain its ability to exercise unfettered and hegemonic power, if I could put it that way, in the region. And that's why I think constraining China, which is very different to containing China, and we might be able to get into that later in the discussion, is so important. And the last thing I'd just say by way of general introduction is that this strategy of balancing China is getting much more complicated for Australia, not least because we don't know where America currently sits in that strategy, and the shifting nature of America's geopolitical posture under Trump is something that is very central to how we think about China. And then you have the bigger question, and this goes to values again, as to whether the US itself, which has always been a values partner for Australia, is shifting towards a much more illiberal political system under President Trump. And what does that mean for the nature of our alliance relationship?
Hi. It's so wonderful to be able to speak openly, freely, and to see people's friendly faces, given that for 3 years and 2 months, I wasn't allowed to do that. I'm a bit schizophrenic because I was born in China but came to Australia when I was 10. I'm bilingual, bicultural, and prior to my arrest, I had thought that this was a huge plus, that I understood both sides and that I was trying to better the understanding. And then the 3 years and 2 months of incarceration led me to think deeply about freedom, about what we give up and what we gain, and what sort of society do I want to be a part of. And after my release, it's been more than 2 years, unbelievably, I've had a lot of strange things happen to me because of the warped nature of Chinese influence and interference. We'll get to the details in a little bit. And I've also made a lot of observations about overseas Chinese, the diaspora, how they view Australia-China relations, how they view Australian politics and how they're treated, and also how we self-censor. So, for example, when I was unfairly locked up on these ludicrous charges of espionage, who dared to speak up for me loudly in the business community? If you had a directorship in China, did you think twice about the repercussions if you spoke up for me? And of course, it's not just about me. For example, I've invited to this very event extremely experienced and accomplished, shall we say, mining tycoon, Jerry, who's sitting in the audience, who was jailed for 5 years and 7 months in China. Extremely horrific conditions, totally lacking in due process. And would we have spoken up for him if we had a lot to lose? We have so much fear in Australia because of various reasons. For example, the overseas diaspora who have their personal identity fused with the Chinese identity and therefore the Communist Party, that they feel personally attacked when China is criticized. And when we first of all, lack hard data on voting attitudes of the overseas Chinese, but then our politicians have such PTSD from, say, the 22 election that they soften their speech, that we cannot have an honest conversation like we are having here tonight about Australia-China relations. Then how are we going to advance our own interests and make sure that when we engage we are not being manipulated? And do we recognize what it is to be subtly influenced? And again, we'll get to the details in a little bit. But I would like to see our media, of which I am a part, cover China much better, much more widely, deeply, and again, the difficulties we can discuss. I was with the Australian's China correspondent last week, and just to get that rare earth story involved being chased around town. It involved mid-interview, suddenly plainclothes policemen appearing, stopping the interview. You cannot find it on any mapping tools, so you need somebody to take you to the rare earths factory, and so many difficulties to do with covering China. And our level of China literacy is actually going down, as Peter will attest to with some data. So those are my gripes.
Thanks, everyone. I think the purpose of tonight is to expose our audience to a diversity of views, but you may have noticed as Peter and Lei were talking, I was furiously nodding my head most of the time. So let's all keep that in mind. My background to this topic began in 1988 when I was studying economics as a grade 11 student at Coorparoo State High School, just a few kilometres away from here. I wrote an assignment on China's economy and was hooked. I then went on to study a Bachelor of Economics at the University of Queensland, where I was at the same time you were there, Lei, actually.
Wow.
You were studying commerce, I was studying economics.
UQ students, this is a real reunion.
I was a pretty ordinary student, to be honest, except for any courses that involved Asia's economic development, and those I just absolutely devoured. I then did a PhD on financial reform in China, and then began an academic career that included setting up the first undergraduate course in Australia on the Chinese economy. That was at UQ in 2006. In 2014, I moved to UTS, and these days I spend just as much time thinking about the Australia-China relationship in terms of geopolitics as I do economics. I think it is really useful for our audience tonight to hear about Peter, Lei, and my background, because our position in significant part determines the touch points we all have with China. Lei, you were just mentioning your experience of being a journalist in China. And as open-minded as I'm sure we all try to be, it is impossible not to be impacted somewhat by those touch points that each of us have. Let me just give you one example. I just returned from China 3 days ago. When I was there, I had the opportunity to spend a decent amount of time with a young woman from a poor rural family in central China, but who is now studying at a university in Shanghai, China's commercial capital. This young woman was delightful. Never has left China, but was utterly curious about the outside world, as well as being whip smart. Well, after having hundreds of those sorts of experiences over the last 30 years that I've been going to China, when I see the Australian public routinely presented, when I see China presented to the Australian public routinely as soldiers marching in unison with some big missiles behind them, at a military parade, well, that's not the China that I first encountered 30 years ago, and it's not the China that I still experience today. But of course, that military capability, as Peter referenced, is real, right? And I'm not suggesting we shouldn't pretend anything otherwise, and it absolutely could be used to threaten Australian interests. And so a national security practitioner, unlike an economist like me, is absolutely right to be focused on it. Still, I guess one of the messages that I want to get across tonight is I would suggest that a bigger part of our national interest involves thinking about and engaging with broader swathes of Chinese society and even the Chinese government that are not the People's Liberation Army. And I'm not suggesting that's the only troubling part of the Chinese government. Mike Pizzullo, one of Australia's most hawkish commentators, says he puts the chance of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait at between 10 to 20%. Well, there you go. So what Mike's telling you actually is he thinks there's an 80 to 90% chance that nothing's going to happen. right? So I'd like to see the weight of our national effort be put into engaging with China in forms like that young woman I met last week. And that's not just because we can sell her stuff, right? It's because if you spend time with people like that, what you'll realise is that we actually have an awful lot in common with these people on a whole range of issues. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much to all of you. I think you've seen already that we've got, from the different perspectives and different backgrounds, a lot to dig into. I wanted to go back to this duality question and the balance. You know, can we have all the things we want from our relationship with China, more broadly than the economic, but very substantially the economy as a focus for the relationship, at the same time as maintaining the United States alliance in a form which gives us and them, in a mutual benefit way, a sense of security that comes from there being the other major power involved in the region. Peter, we've watched with a bit of dismay some of the developments in the current administration in the United States, as you've noted. Should we be comforted by the summit season meetings that we've seen with President Trump in the region, speaking constructively, not setting aside the questions of tariffs that concern all our regional neighbours as well as Australia? President rated the meeting with the President of China as a 12 out of 10. What do you think's going on? And can we have a clearer sense of what is really emerging in the United States? We get this diplomacy by not press release anymore, it's social media postings. And the consistency, there's a lot of transparency, but the consistency isn't always there. There are many voices around the president, and there are many views in Washington, but what do you see? Is there a strategic outlook? Is there an intention on the part of the United States to reach more than a simple trade deal kind of compromise and establish a kind of workable, more predictable relationship with China? Or do we have uncertainty ahead for a while to come?
Well, I think, to put it mildly, President Trump is a very different American president, certainly very different to any president that Australia has had to deal with in the post-Second World War period. Because for the last 80 years, every US administration has had an organizing principle around which strategic policy was crafted, and that was to preserve the strategic primacy of the United States and to ensure that no one would be in a position, particularly in terms of controlling Eurasia, to challenge the primacy of the United States. I simply don't know what the organizing principle of President Trump is, and at the end of the day, it is what he thinks that matters rather than what those around him thinks that matters. And I think increasingly we'll see on China a difference of view emerging between what the president says and what some of the senior officials in the Pentagon and the State Department might say. Trump, in my view, has essentially a businessman's view of the world. And that is that most things are essentially zero-sum, that they are winners and they are losers, that leverage is all important, and that you find leverage and exercise it wherever you can. I don't think he necessarily thinks about US strategic primacy in the way that his predecessors do, although I suspect he takes it for granted. In other words, he simply assumes that the United States has strategic primacy, and that adds to the leverage that the United States is able to exercise. But for the moment, at least, the key points of leverage that the president seems to look at are economic leverage. And that is why we see his tariffs policy playing out in the way that it does. It's why we see even his own self-image as a peacemaker being shaped by the ability to threaten countries who are at war with economic penalties if they were to continue it. Witness his intervention in the India-Pakistan conflict, although India, of course, disputes whether or not he did play a role. So this is a very different way of looking at the world. And one of the key questions for Australia, I think, is to what extent does President Trump consider a collective approach to strategic balancing is important, or is he fundamentally a unilateralist? And I think most of the evidence would suggest the latter rather than the former. And that has some rather big implications for Australia, because a unilateral balancing of China, in my view, has a reasonably high chance of failing as economic weight shifts and as the US power, strong as it is, and I think the United States will remain the strongest single power for some considerable period of time, but it's clear that the margin of US power is declining, and the era of unchallenged US strategic primacy is also fading. So a unilateralist approach that is attempted and fails will leave China immeasurably stronger as a result. It also essentially pushes to the margin countries like Japan and Australia and India, the other members of the so-called Quad, because all of our strategic policies are essentially based on a collective joint balancing of China. So the unknowns in Trump's position have very large consequences, and those large consequences relate not only to the economic policies that he pursues, but also to our core strategic interests. And I suspect we're going to live with a level of uncertainty for a considerable period of time. I'm not one who thinks that Trump represents the new normal in the United States, but nor do I think that Trump is just a complete aberration, because there are some deeper structural forces that sit behind his ascendancy to political power, and he is tapping into a sentiment in the United States about the global role of the United States, which I don't think will disappear with President Trump.
Thanks, Peter. I'm sure on that point you're right, and we've seen some of this creeping through for years, but it's the acceleration, I think, in the change that has people a bit back-footed. I want to move on then to China and stick with the economic power question that you've had in your remarks, Peter, in relation to leverage. And I'll start with you, James, since it's an area of your particular expertise. I mean, on many measures, China is close to or matches the United States. Some argue China is not a rising power, it's a risen power. And yet we're also very conscious of the alternative pathway that China's economic trajectory is tracked. None of it sits very comfortably with the Washington consensus economic models that you and I suspect were trained in and have worked in for many years. And yet China's pathway to powerful growth and modernity, the state guidance, the support for directed industries, albeit with elements, very strong elements of business competition at different levels in China, is very different from what we're accustomed to. And combined with those powers that touch more on the things that Lei was speaking about, security powers, constraints on political and religious freedom, the picture is a very different and in some respects confronting one for us. But the results are there. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you see the Chinese economy developing, the new industries that have been startling, the AI, the robotics, the technology-related sectors. And what we see is a China proud of its achievements and not just promoting those to the world, but also the Chinese model for economic development is becoming a kind of outreach point for Beijing, particularly in the global south. Are they right? Is China unstoppable? Or are those fragilities that we know about in the Chinese model, the demographics, for example? Talk a little bit about that, perhaps. The effectiveness of the state planning when you look at something like the property sector overhang. Is it really clear that China's model will work, at least for China and perhaps elsewhere? And will the risks of pushing too hard its own perspectives alienate some of the Western countries upon whose market China depends?
Okay, I think there are about 6 questions there, but I'll try and keep this very tight. Look, speaking as an economist, China is the world's largest economy, right? Don't kid yourself. It's not the United States. Its ability to produce stuff is now about 25% larger than that of the United States. And yet, its per person income is still only around that of 1/3 of that of the United States. So in other words, it's still got a long way to go. The Chinese economy is certainly sluggish at the moment, no question about that, and that's largely because of a property market that's been in reverse for the last 4 years. But a point I'd make about that is despite that major headwind, China's economy hasn't collapsed. Okay? If you believe the Chinese government data, they'll tell you it's still growing at 5%. But even if you don't believe that, say it's growing at 2%. Well, if China's still growing at 2% and its property market is in reverse, that points to some extraordinary areas of strength in the Chinese economy. And we see plenty of those in Australia, right? I know we're in Sydney streets and I'd be surprised if it's any different here. Drive around Brisbane streets these days and I'm guessing you see Chinese cars everywhere, not just electric vehicles, BYD, Chery, GWM and so on. They're everywhere. So, Joanna, I think what that does point to in terms of what are the implications for Australia is that Australia's economy and China's economy are the most two extraordinarily complementary economies that you could possibly imagine. Over time, China's economy is actually becoming more competitive with that of the US, more competitive with that of Japan, more competitive with that of the EU, not with Australia, right? China's not just our largest market for traditional exports like iron ore, it's also our largest market for fuels, it's our largest market for crops, it's our largest market for livestock products, it's our largest market for tourism, it's our largest market for education. So those complementarities haven't disappeared, and in fact, they're actually expanding. So then the question becomes, well, that leads to a pretty big economic exposure. Yes, it does, right? About 1/3 of our exports go to China. Now, plenty of people will say, that's not good because that actually gives China coercive leverage over Australia to punish us if we start doing things in the political or strategic realm that China doesn't like. Well, Theoretically, but in practice, no, not at all. In fact, we've got a case study of this now. It actually makes it much easier to talk about. In 2020, Beijing gave Australia an almighty whack, right? It cut off market access for around a dozen Australian goods. The impact on the Australian economy? More or less zero. Except if you're a wine producer and a lobster fisher, and if you're in the audience, you probably want to throw something at me now. But certainly at a macroeconomic, the impact was zero. Why was that? 2 quick points, Joe, and then I'll stop. First of all, what we discovered was that there are a whole bunch of goods that we're not dependent on China. We're actually mutually interdependent, right? China's dependent on us. China didn't hit iron ore, it didn't hit LNG, it didn't hit lithium, it didn't hit wheat, it didn't hit wool. That's because it relies on us as a supplier as much as we rely on China as a market. Second point, just because Beijing gives us a whack, it doesn't mean we can't defend ourselves. We can, and it's not even hard. When China said we don't want your coal anymore, our coal producers literally shrugged their shoulders. Ditto our beef producers, ditto our barley producers. Those goods are sold in open and competitive global markets, so if China doesn't want them, fine. There's plenty of other countries that do.
Wine? Is wine easier to diversify compared to the other
So this is a good point. Is wine easy to diversify? No, it's not. But here's the big hope for that. We were hoping that our geopolitical mates would come to our rescue. And in fact, they said they would. Kurt Campbell said that don't have to worry, Australia, we've got your back. You know what happened to US purchases of Australian wine when it was locked out of the Chinese market? They went backwards, right? So that's a case where there is real pain involved, but it's not as if we can pin our hopes on saving us on our geopolitical friends.
Can I just make 2 points? One is, I think if you rely on the internal contradictions of the Chinese system to lead to the collapse of the Chinese economy, you're likely to be waiting a very long time. Countries have an enormous capacity to defy the laws of economic gravity. I mean, North Korea should have collapsed decades and decades ago, and it's still going. The other thing to bear in mind here is that if you're looking at where the US and China stand economically, the US, in my view at the moment, is engaging in policies that are significantly weakening the United States economy. I mean, the great irony of the MAGA movement, making America great again, is that the Trump policies are doing whatever it can to weaken the elements that have made America great in the past, whether that is immigration and all of the benefits that immigration has brought to the United States, including in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship, or its frontal attack on the university sector, which has been the incubator for innovation and fundamental research. So if you've got China with an element of predictability and the United States at the moment moving in a direction which seems to be against its own interests, at the end of the day, you've got to hope like hell that self-correcting historical tradition in the United States clicks back into place. Because otherwise, this gap is actually, whether you say it's already overtaken the US, or whether you think it's behind, depending on market exchange rates or purchasing power parity, this gap is definitely narrowing. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago, would China or the United States have leadership in the industries of the future, I would have said the United States without hesitation. I think that is now a very open question, and if anything, China is making claims to it in a way that we wouldn't have thought of before.
Unless it weakens so fast, so much that the self-correction happens earlier.
James, just before leaving and moving to ask Lei some questions about the link between Chinese economy and some of the domestic political questions, I just want to come back to your observation. I was very interested to hear you say that you thought the complementarity was still going gangbusters, and yet a lot of people have been concerned about the decline of the construction economy being a major focus for China compared with its new industries, and therefore its need for some of our resources which after all are a very substantial whack of our total trade, of declining. So is that an issue? And it's also itself actively looking for diversified import sources. So one of the concerns I've been observing and reading about is the declining complementarity. So it'll be very interesting to see that play out. But
Sure. Look, if you're talking about specific goods, you can find examples. I mean, China's a massive economy. You'll always be able to find examples of everything. So, but you mentioned the declining construction activity in China. Well, that's not new. That's happened since 2021. And last year, we exported a record volume of iron ore to China, right? That's just a fact. So what happened? Well, it turns out that there's other sectors of the Chinese economy that want our iron ore too. In particular, manufacturing's been a big one. But Joanna, for sure, over the coming decade, China will demand less Australian iron ore. Definitely, okay? Its industrialisation has reached a peak where its steel demand is going to tail off. But here's the point, it's going to tail off, right? It's not going to collapse. The best estimates I've seen is that we're probably looking at around about a 10-20% decline in China's demand over the next decade. Well, that's material, that's significant. But if in the first 8 months of this year, Australia imported $5 billion worth of cars from China. 3 years ago, we were hardly importing anything. Last year, we exported $5 billion worth of lithium to China. 5 years ago, we were hardly exporting anything, right? So I just think if you look at the whole basket of goods and services that Australia and China trade in, the two economies remain incredibly complementary.
okay, thank you.
And you're saying that the last round of whacking our economy didn't really whack us. So the way we act, the way we speak, the way we think is not hampered by our China dependency.
I would say so, Lei. I mean, when I look at the Australian government, we banned Huawei in 2018. We introduced foreign interference laws in 2020. We pursued the AUKUS pact. We do things that annoy Chinese diplomats seemingly on a daily basis, but we do them anyway because we think it's in our national interest. And what I think the episode of 2020 to 2023 has demonstrated is we can actually do that with a bit of confidence because we can manage those risks. Now, in taking those steps to protect our national interest, I don't think that means we should abandon calm and professional diplomacy. So my criticism of the Morrison government wouldn't have been its policies, but the way they ran diplomacy with China was something like I have never seen in the history of Australia's diplomatic relationship with China since 1972.
Okay, can we move on?
So I was in the room when, in Parliament House in Canberra, when I saw how both sides, that's the coalition and the Labor Party, reacted when the Chinese diplomats were trying to block me. I saw the fear. And it's not just Albanese, it's Peter Dutton and his team as well. After the election, there is a real sense of we don't want to set China off. Some of the strange things that have happened, the Chinese consulate in Melbourne tried to shut down one of my talks in Melbourne. There were spies in a very small audience of stand-up that I tried to do with Vicky Xu, an activist/journalist. The Chinese embassy in Canberra gives talks to Melbourne schoolgirls about why communism is the greatest system ever. Patriots right now are being rounded up, as in Chinese patriots, are being rounded up by the embassy to welcome a certain leader who will visit from the 23rd to the 26th of November, and on and on. And our SBS, our multicultural media organisation, has people who are very, very friendly with the United Front, and that changes what they write and how they edit. Student associations, community organisations, all being supported by the United Front or the consulate, the embassy, and much less likely to invite guests who have unpopular opinions. Last year I was in Canberra doing a panel, and because one of my guests, or the Chinese guest, has anti-CCP views, we couldn't find any interpreter brave enough to do the interpreting, even going as far as say, can I do this via the phone? I mean, I can speak in public about China freely, but so many Chinese people dare not. So they don't need to do anything. They've set an example with me. There's a Chinese idiom, kill one to make an example for 100. They don't need to actually bash us, but it's the fear of being bashed that's holding us back. And which is why I would like more transparency, more understanding of how the Chinese system works, how such a mighty country, and I would agree with all those things you say, all its accomplishments, and the incredibly industrious people who have created this economic miracle, and accept extremely unjust social contracts with this government, just because this is already better than the deals they've had previously. So I agree with that, but how can they at the same time be so insecure and so petty and so hypocritical and dishonest about their intentions? They're always saying, oh, we don't allow other countries to meddle in our affairs and we don't do that to them. But that is blatantly a lie.
Thanks, Lei. Look, I wanted to move back, if I could, to this sort of question of the economy and link that to this kind of behaviour that I think you're alluding to here, the more assertive tone, the end of hide and bide, if you like, the idea that China, having achieved such success, really needs the rest of the world to know and to be acknowledged for what it's done, including the fact that China should play a bigger part in setting the rules of the global scene.
Setting, not manipulating.
Can you say a little bit more about the China dream? Peter began with some observations about the Middle Kingdom and Chinese ideas of their place in the world, and the long-standing grievances from the century of humiliation and so on. I'm not sure how well that's known and understood in Australia as a backdrop to some of what looks sometimes to us like awkward,
overreaction,
clunky reactions. Yes. Wolf warrior diplomacy seems to be on the wane. How
moderating?
Can you just a couple of minutes on that?
So when I went to China at the end of 2000, I was a business analyst, and I was with a Australian-Chinese joint venture that was basically the other partner was a very, very powerful state-owned organisation. And I saw the corruption, I saw the entrepreneurship, and over the next 20 years, I saw the incredible opportunities that freeing up the economy to a more capitalist model had given the Chinese people. And I was, until my arrest, I was really enjoying covering that. But in retrospect, and having gone through what I've gone through, I wonder if at some point China's rise, China's economic power, gave it a sense of moral infallibility. So if we're making people richer and now more countries depend on us, then we don't have to reform, we don't have to liberalize. And you look at many of the sectors that China is very strong in, they all have extremely clever and innovative private firms. appliances. When China entered the WTO, there was this newspaper headline after headline would say, the wolves are coming, meaning the Siemens, the Toshibas, all the foreign brands will eat our appliance makers alive. And what turned out was, because the state didn't protect that sector, it became one of the most competitive and innovative of them all really fast. And you see that with car makers as well. The private car makers have turned out to be some of the best performing. So now you have this sense that China is superior in its model, and that the rest of the world will eat our dust. And sorry, can you just remind me your question again? I was getting to this point.
Look, I think you've given us a good start. So let's move on a bit. I'm a bit worried about our timing.
Joanna, can I just make one point, because it goes to the China dream? So reviving a glorious past is a trend
Yes,
we're seeing in many parts of the world. So with China, it's getting over 100 years of humiliation. With India, it's getting over 2,000 years of colonization, back to the great days of Hindu empires. With Russia, it's returning to the greater days of the Russian Empire. With Turkey, it's going back to the great days of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, this is a thread now in the psyche of international relations, which is exerting a very powerful force. And I see China as just one example of that narrative.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. So, look, I wanted to move us more now to the Australia-China relationship and what's at stake for us, and how well or not we're managing it. I think you've made some points already, James, along these lines about the way Australia had handled the period of coercive trade policy from China successfully, really. We have, you also, I think, enumerated a number of things where we had drawn red lines and stuck to them, and ultimately those seem to be understood. But how do we read China's perspective on this now? We've had a very successful, I think, prime ministerial visit recently, carrying with him traveling with him a huge business delegation that...
I've heard that China is very happy with us to the extent of allowing us an unprecedented 13 hours in the super secretive Zhongnanhai compound where the leaders work and live. And that I also heard that there is a real charm offensive to our China hands in Australia at the moment. So just two observations.
Right. Well, but at the same time, there was some commentary in the media about that just gave a little sense that there was it wasn't all plain sailing in the sense that I think that the language that was used in the observations I read from high sources were Australia needs to be careful about shaking hands at the table while kicking under it.
I think that was in the Global Times.
Yes. So do you have some thoughts about that, James? Is this the beginning of a sense of waning Chinese tolerance for us drawing our red lines and persisting with our national interest policies that don't fit the...
If your question is, do I think China could blow up again, or Beijing could blow up again at Australia like it did in 2020, I rate that possibility as very low. Because I think what China learnt was that when it engaged in the wolf warrior diplomacy, when it engaged in the economic coercion, actually, in the end, it didn't serve China's own interests. I remember speaking with Chinese diplomats by the end of 2021, and it was pretty clear to me that they were looking for an off-ramp. And when I speak with academics just a couple of weeks ago, that they're of that view too. I do find it interesting that when we talk about Chinese assertiveness, we use terms like wolf warrior, right? Chinese trade punishment, economic coercion. It's interesting because when we talk about the United States, we don't use those terms. I mean, you would have all seen the footage of the President of the United States utterly berating world leaders in the Oval Office. And we just call, oh, he's got a unique personality, doesn't he? Right? It's not, we don't call him a wolf warrior. The economic punishment...
That's because the Chinese president doesn't do press conferences.
Well, sure. But the economic punishment that the US is unleashing on the rest of the world now, including Australia, including walking away from a free trade agreement that we signed with them 20 years ago, we never call that economic coercion. So, and like you mentioned before that there is some hesitancy in the Australian government to, I guess you're mainly talking about civil society, right? But amongst Australian diplomats, there is some hesitancy to, you know, we don't want to make China angry. Well, gee...
No, not just diplomats, politicians.
Just 2 seconds. I mean, I would suggest when Australia engages with the United States, we are absolutely petrified of not wanting to make Americans angry either.
You can criticise both.
Indeed, for sure.
Okay. Well, look, where to? I was really going to sort of see if I could get a litmus test report card kind of sense from each of you about how Australia is managing the duality in the relationship, this sort of steady, calm tone, the settling of relationships. In fact, the engagement, the first engagement of the Prime Minister with the President of the United States as well, all in recent weeks, that this tricky duality so far seems to be holding fairly steadily or not. What do you think? Where are we at?
Well, look, I think up to now, the Australian government has managed the relationship pretty effectively. And in one sense, they were pushing on an open door because, as James has indicated, I think the Chinese system had come to the view that there was going to be very limited returns in continuing to keep Australia into the deep freeze. So there was an instinct on both sides to try and fix this, and a change of government in Australia, Albanese's first term, provided an obvious sort of entry point into that. Whether or not that now stabilisation can move into something a bit more positive than just stabilising a relationship, I think will depend on a lot of external factors, because, you know, we just need to be realistic about the fact that our agency is not the exclusive shaper of how this relationship is managed and what it delivers. It's going to be always seen from a Chinese perspective in a much broader context than just a bilateral relationship. I think the economic relationship seems to me to have a lot of growth tissue left in it, for all of the reasons that James indicated. I think the days when we could talk about a comprehensive strategic partnership with China are long gone, although it remains in the diplomatic lexicon of both sides. Maybe whispered now more than proclaimed. But the way in which the US-China relationship plays out in our region, I think, is also going to be another dimension to the Australia-China relationship. So the way in which that relationship is perceived in Japan or in Korea or in Delhi or in Southeast Asia, all of that, I think, is something we need to take into account when we're thinking about where to take the bilateral relationship with China.
Exactly where I wanted to move, actually. I mean, we have talked about the balancing that we need to do for very clear national interest reasons, but we're not alone in that. Our regional neighbours, you've just listed them, Peter, Japan, Korea, most of the ASEANs, India, New Zealand, and so on, are all challenged in the same way. And our, particularly our Asian partners, have suffered much more heavily from the imposition of Trump tariffs than the rest, than we have certainly, but have been disproportionately affected because of the linkage their deep integration with China, Chinese supply chains and so on. Is there scope to do more, to work? You talked about working collectively and not necessarily bilaterally on all these issues. Is there more we can do with our neighbours to shore up the things that matter to us, that we're dismayed about, on the one hand, from the United States in relation to the weakening, dismantling to some extent of the existing trade rules framework, which is deeply unsettling and potentially costly for Australia and most of the region. What is there that we can do to work with others? And in some respects, Chinese interests overlap with some of those of Southeast Asia and ourselves.
I think inevitably this brave new world that we're entering into is going to require Australia to deepen its relationships in the region, probably across the board, partly to compensate for what I think is going to be a slightly different US-Australia relationship, much more transactional, a little bit more skeptical. All of those things, I think, will then lead us to develop a stronger interest in and a bigger investment in our regional relationships. But it will vary depending on the country in the region. I mean, Southeast Asia as a grouping has no interest in joining a balancing strategy. Southeast Asia would like to see a balance. They recognize the virtue of a balance, but they will not contribute to the balance in the sense of making a choice to enter one side or the other of the balance. Japan is in a very different position. I mean, Japan, I think, fundamentally, it requires a balancing of China to protect its strategic interests. Korea, in my view, is more likely than not to go down a much more independent path, probably nuclear armed with or without reunification. And India is trying to work out what the hell has happened. Because, for decades, they were the beneficiary of US strategic altruism because the United States saw it as naturally in the column of balancing China, and then all of a sudden the rug seems to have been taken from under their feet. So,
is that recoverable, do you think?
Well, at one level, anything is recoverable, but there's been, I think, a loss of trust in the Indian system as to where the long-term strategic policy of the United States is taking it. And so I think it'll be some time before that relationship can find a sort of a new settling point. But for us, the Asian engagement story is going to become a lot more important, not only because of the US and China, but also all the other things you mentioned, including the complete dismantling of the multilateral system. So saving as much of the furniture of multilateralism is a very important objective for Australia. And to do that, we do need to work more closely with countries in our region. I mean, the great irony now is that the greater believers in trade liberalization are in Asia. They're not in the United States any longer. So it's a different set of relationships, I think.
We haven't really touched on defence posture, but I'm just thinking we're getting close to the time when we should be wrapping up. And I think perhaps it's unless anyone wants to dip into the question of AUKUS and next steps and South China Sea issues and so on, perhaps we should move to the questions. So do we have our, yes, Simon?
So the microphone here, microphone here.
So please.
I just a reason to SMS question. Last question. Please put your hand up.
Yes, so thank you everyone. My phone has been blowing up with a million text messages, so thank you for that. This is a bit of a synthesized version of some of the questions that came through. So I got a lot of questions about red lines for Australia. Mr. Varghese was talking about Australia should deal with China based on values and interests. We got some questions about what specifically would those red lines be. We got some questions about an invasion of Taiwan as well as a bit of an example. So what should Australia do in the event of an invasion of Taiwan, and what do you think it's likely to do?
Well, I think the first thing Australia should do is to do anything we can to try and prevent a conflict between the United States and China, because the consequences of a conflict between the United States and China would be enormous, not just for the US and China, but for the region and for Australian interests. Personally, I don't think the likelihood of a war over China is all that high. I don't think China is looking to take on the United States in a military conflict. I think China's strategic policy for a very long time has been to win wars without fighting. And I suspect they have that ambition across the Taiwan Straits as well. I think under President Trump, there would be a real question as to whether the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan were there to be a military action across the strait. Unlikely, though, I think that is to be. I mean, President Biden went a long way towards abolishing strategic ambiguity and making it clear that the United States would defend Taiwan. I think everything that President Trump has said suggests to me that he sees things quite differently. So, there's a lot of press given to the fact that Xi Jinping has asked for the PLA to be ready by 2027 to take Taiwan if necessary. I don't think we should read that as the Chinese moving towards an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. So there is a real national interest here for us in doing what we can to avoid conflict between the US and China.
I have friends who go through all of the public speeches of Xi where he mentions war readiness, and it is something like 100 times on public occasions. There are things like tunnels being built in Fujian province, which is very close to Taiwan, strategic resources stockpiling, blood donation stations being built, civilian militia being trained. So that is one thing. Another is the word on the street is that the generals or military commanders who are not as gung-ho about military intervention have lost their jobs. But then I also hear that on the Taiwan side, there is now, everything's very fluid. It's all changing by the month, that there is less fear about an actual China mainland takeover, from some polls. And it is hard to say whether of course, 2027 is the 100-year anniversary of the PLA, whether the invasion will happen, or is it just a date that's been mentioned for war readiness.
Yeah, and it's also true that as a proportion of its economy, China spends less on its military than Australia does. It spends about half that as the US. So I think it's important that we keep that context in mind. You often hear this statement, China spends more on its military than the rest of Asia combined. Yes, its economy is bigger than the rest of Asia combined. So China is capable of assembling enormous military might that we can't ignore. I'm certainly not suggesting we should, but let's just keep it in context.
Thank you.
China spends more defending against its own people than on the military.
Indeed.
Could we have another question from the floor, please?
Oh, hello? Yep. So this is, I think Cheng may have brought this up earlier, and I just want to ask a bit more detail. So after the 2022 federal election, the Liberal Party carried out an internal review, and it deemed that the Morrison government's rhetoric was a key reason why the party lost the Chinese vote across the capital cities. So I guess my question is, how much credence do you give that review? Because now the Liberal Party is effectively acting on that policy, so they don't dare to criticize China because it may offend local Chinese voters. How much credibility do you give that review? And in your research, do you feel like that review may have, have gaps in how they actually got the attitudes of local Chinese voters? Thanks.
I don't know what data they use, but I know of, say, the Menzies electorate in Melbourne, which has the highest concentration of Chinese Australians. In the Liberal Party room after the election loss, the Chinese volunteers were crying because they felt that the party had let them down. And of the 1.4 million overseas Chinese or Chinese Australians with Chinese heritage, I haven't read data that shows their voting eligibility and their voting attitudes. But I guess anecdotally, there is this sense, and I see this perpetuated on Chinese language social media platforms about Australian politics. For example, the Liberal Senator Jane Hume had made the unfortunate comment of Chinese spies about a United Front affiliated volunteer with the Labor Party, and that was at Labor or Liberal anyway. But that comment stuck so much that she became known as Chinese spy woman. So the negative rhetoric can really, really damage sentiment, and especially given the psychological difference in the Chinese Australians perceive any slight to China as, they take it personally, which others probably wouldn't.
James, did you want to add?
No, I disagree. Anecdotally, the Chinese Australian electorate shifted towards Labor over the 2022 and the 2025 election. I think it's fascinating what's going on in the coalition at the moment with that electorate. Let me just make a broader point. These are Australians, okay? We call them Chinese Australians, but they're Australians. And Australians in a democracy are allowed to hold any views that they want as long as it's not contrary to Australian law. So just because...
Unless they are influenced covertly.
Exactly. And that's why, thank God, we have foreign interference laws, right? So you'll not see a single negative comment from me about Australia introducing foreign interference laws or enforcing those laws. We certainly need to protect our diaspora from that, from that interference. I don't disagree.
But in reality, it's much more subtle. For example, WeChat groups where the Chinese host of the group will say, anyone who has, views about Taiwan reunification or Taiwan independence should get out, shouldn't speak in this group. That sort of fear.
Peter.
Can I just say, I think the Morrison government got hoisted on its own petard at the end of the day because, James referred to Australian diplomacy in that period as being, the worst that he's seen. This was not clumsy diplomacy by accident. This was a judgment that it played well domestically in Australia to be seen to take a very tough line on China. And so the tougher the line, the better the domestic play. What happened as a consequence of all of that is that it did have an impact in 5 or 6 seats with a reasonably high proportion of Chinese Australians who voted against the coalition and for the Labor Party in 2022. And that, remember, was a very close election. And so I think there's some truth to the review as quoted by the questioner about the outcome and its link back to a position on China.
Yes.
We have a question from Pavlo Voitenko. For firms doing transaction diligence in Queensland, so mergers and acquisitions, private equity, infrastructure, what are the red flags or early indicators in the China-Australia relationship that should trigger a recalibration of valuation or risk premium? How far out should we be looking, e.g. supply chain fragility, export bans, investment screening changes?
I think that's one for you, James.
Yeah, sure. Look, last week, I was in Shanghai for the China International Import Expo, a major trade fair. And I was talking to a major Australian company there about how they were viewing geopolitical risk. And he said two things to me, this C-suite executive. He said, first of all, geopolitical risk is just one of the many risks that we have to deal with daily. Businesses deal with risks, and that's a routine operation for them. He said the biggest risk they actually have in China is not really geopolitical risk like we saw in 20, it's more regulatory risk. The fact that the regulations could change overnight and suddenly their business strategy they were implementing previously doesn't work so well. But then he said the second thing to me, he said, but you know what? Regulatory risk is a whole lot worse in Vietnam, Malaysia and India. So that's the challenge for Australian business. It's not finding perfection. No one's going to find that. But actually, I think most businesses, when they engage with China, it's not perfect, but they look around the region and they don't see a lot of other better options.
No, indeed. Do we have anything further? Yes.
James, could I ask you, you mentioned the whip-smart young Chinese lady, and I thought you were going to tell us a bit more about her. But what was her perception of Australia, and what do you think that Chinese people, if there is such an entity as the Chinese people, think about Australia? Is it just a good place to come and hold koalas, or what do they think?
Well, the short story was I was the first Australian she'd ever met. I mean, she'd literally never left China, and in fact, there's many parts of China she hadn't been to either, so I was it. And I can tell you afterwards, she was posting on her WeChat moments all these pictures of Australian, lamb and meat and and koalas and so on. So I think Chinese people are pretty positive at a fundamental sense towards Australia. But look, actually, let me say this. The truth is most Chinese don't wake up in the morning and think about Australia, right? And the Chinese government certainly don't. They wake up in the morning and think about China, China, China. And then fourth in the list is they probably think about America, not Australia.
I am a follower of the Chinese version of Quora, Zhihu, and it's very, very good for gleaning attitudes of the middle class about Australia, about immigration, because it's such a hot topic. And of those answers, the people who have already emigrated would say that if you are powerful and moneyed, come to Australia, you'll be fine. If you have no money, if you are struggling and you're able to come to Australia, you'd love it. But for those who kind of get along fairly well in the Chinese system and enjoy the nightlife and cheap courier services and other personal services and so on, they might find it hard to stay here. But those who love it here would always mention the kindness of the people, the fact that animals aren't afraid of people, the freedom and the much more relaxed pace of life due to the 996 from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week kind of working lifestyle in China. But there are some really interesting answers there.
Thanks. Yes.
Hello, could I ask the panelists, what's your opinion on the medium to long-term consequences of the demographic situation, with China's fertility rate now being about 1.0, which of course is less than half the replacement rate?
Yeah, look, it's a headwind, but I don't panic about it because, first of all, demographic trends are a headwind, but they don't change overnight, right? So in other words, that does at least give the Chinese government opportunity to respond in the policy realm. And you're seeing some of that. For example, historically, China's had a low female participation rate in the workforce. Okay, so you can work on that one. The retirement age can be raised.
The participation rate is very high. I know.
I'm pretty sure if you check China
high.
compared with other countries,
it's just the glass ceiling is very low.
I'm just looking at the data. Okay, so automation's another option that China has available to it. And the other thing I'll say, and sounds awful, so I'm an economist speaking here. Okay. you can talk about the quantity and the quality of the labour force. Economists talk about this. They don't mean this in a moral way. But if you look at the people that are exiting the Chinese labour force, they're typically people who had a primary school education, no more. The people entering the Chinese labour force are, often, have PhDs, master's degrees, and so on. So in terms of the productivity of the labour force, in aggregate, it's not something I panic about. There's other things I worry about more.
I think it's probably more than headwinds. I mean, if you do believe that demography is destiny, then the age profile in China would have to be a pretty serious concern to you. But bear in mind that this is now a global trend, because in virtually every country in the world, we are seeing a drop in fertility. Even in those parts of the world like Africa and South Asia, which we traditionally sort of picture as having very high fertility rates and large families, the graphs are consistently coming down in terms of fertility. So this is going to become actually quite a serious long-term global problem. And I'm not sure there are a lot of answers that are readily available.
I think it might be beyond us this evening. But thank you for the question. It's a very live one, and questions appreciated.
There's more questions.
We have another synthesised question. So a lot of the questions that have been sent in concern the growing influence of China among Pacific Island nations. And also one thing that was pointed out was that China has undertaken a very significant military build-up, one of the largest since, I think, the largest since World War II, and that doesn't belie peaceful intent. So can we get some comment from the panel on China's growing influence in the Pacific? What's the state of competition between Australia and China and the United States in the Pacific? And should we be concerned considering that China has had this large military build-up?
Peter, do you want to start on the Pacific and move to the other two panelists?
Yeah, so I mean, the foreign minister has described this as a permanent competition between Australia and China, and I think there's a fair degree of truth to that. I mean, China is pursuing influence across the world, so it's not as if the Pacific is sort of uniquely high on its list of priorities. But for Australia, if a Chinese presence in the Pacific were to extend to the establishment of a military base, that would cause us a very high degree of strategic angst for pretty good reasons. And so I think we are going to have a long-term competition between Australia and China over influence in small Pacific Island countries. Now, I think Australia brings huge assets to that competition in the short and the medium term, because that goes to the density of our connections to the Pacific countries, the networks that we have, the increasing labour market flows between them and Australia, a certain cultural connection, including through football and so on. So in the short to medium term, I'm pretty optimistic that Australia can handle this. In the long term, I suspect it's going to depend on whose pockets are deeper. And there, I think we won't do well.
And we've also lost some of the company that we had in the Pacific since the United States and many European donors have withdrawn.
Could we give the mic to someone who is very qualified to answer this question? Nick Coyle, who fought relentlessly for my freedom, and he's got the lived-in experience of running the chamber in China for a number of years, and also running a business in Papua New Guinea for the past 6 years.
Sorry, what was the question again? No, I'm joking. Sorry, James, I was just fact-checking you on the female participation rate.
Is it true?
No, you're wrong. Sorry.
You can say that about Japan, though.
Yeah. In fact, China's participation rate's been going down, so there you go. So, yeah, getting back to the Pacific, what was the nub of the question was around...
Influence.
Influence. Look, having somebody who grew up in the Pacific and is back there doing business and lived in China for a long time, I'd say we're getting absolutely slaughtered as a regional influencer in the region. Australia is in particular. Our business communities have disengaged in a significant way. China's pushing into the region more and more, especially through other countries, I would say Malaysia in particular. So a lot of Malaysian Chinese business is being used as a proxy for Chinese business into the region, which I'm seeing that more and more now. So it's not only direct Chinese business, but a lot of Chinese support coming through businesses that they influence. So I think that's a huge impact. In my little part of the world, PNG, it's kind of where in my view, the strategic game begins and ends, because it's the most important country in the South Pacific by a country mile. And how that plays out over the next 5 to 10 years, I think is going to be really interesting. But Australia's dropped the ball over the past, and I'm sorry, Peter, not your fault, over the past 25 or 30 years in that region, and we're really paying for it. It's as simple as that. And yeah.
We've had some pretty fast pedaling in the last couple of years, perhaps, but I accept the point you're making. Thanks, Nick.
No problems.
Joe, did you notice the question was that China's increase in military spending belies a peaceful intent? There's a fascinating thing I like to see every year in the Australian media when the Chinese budget gets released. You'll see this headline, China's military spending increases by 10%. Well, that sounds a lot. You notice you never see a headline, China's diplomacy increases by 15%. China's education spending increases by 18%. China's military spending is increasing a lot every year because its economy is growing a lot every year. Its government is spending more on everything. And as I said before, as a proportion of its economy, its military spending is actually less than that of Australia and way behind that of the US.
Are some of the concerns, perhaps, James, related to capability, though? That's the kind of capability that China is developing and the obvious display of that capability?
Well, I'd prefer that they're displaying missiles on the streets of Beijing rather than hurling them at countries like some other countries out there, in fact, routinely do. So is capability
the
something we have
streets
to
that
take...
once killed its own people?
Yeah, no, come on, that's a completely... You're doing a switch of topic there, right? I'm just saying the capability is something we have to take seriously. I don't disagree with that. But put it in context. That's all I'm asking.
Peter,
we should be clear that China's ambition is to be the predominant power in the region. And to become the predominant power, you have to have a very substantial military capability. So you cannot divorce the investment in military capability from the broader strategic objective.
Well, look, on that note, plenty to think about.
And there's so much opacity. I think that's what people are concerned about.
I think we've reached the time in the evening when we need to try to take a breath and ask each of the panelists to end with a concluding remark. There's no shortage of concerns and issues and uncertainty about the future. But James, do you want to? We'll start at the other end of the table here.
Look, I'll just say this. I'm not a member of the Australian Labor Party, I promise you, but I actually think the government's doing a pretty good job. I mean, it's putting in place policies that it sees as necessary to defending our national security. It manages differences with China with calm and professional diplomacy and welcomes expanded cooperation in areas of mutual interest. So that's pretty good. I like it when Anthony Albanese is asked by journalists, is China a threat? Why can't you just call China a threat? Anthony Albanese resists, and I think he is right to resist. Instead, what he does is he focuses on criticising Beijing for specific threatening behaviours, right? That's the right approach to me. Just calling China a threat, that's not moral clarity, that's not analytical accuracy, that's a dumbing down of the framing of China for the Australian public. And I actually think the Albanese government's approach is pretty aligned with that of the Australian public. We do an annual poll of public opinion at the Australian-China Relations Institute, And one of the statements we get Australians to respond to is this one, quote, Australia should try to build strong connections with China, close quote. 61% of Australians agree with that, just 15% disagree, right? The balance are neutral. That's not because Australians think China is all sunlight and roses, far from it. Other parts of the survey make that clear. But as Peter said, China's not going to go away. And so we're far better off engaging with China and managing those differences. And secondly, having stable and constructive relations with China, even amidst those differences, brings enormous benefits, not least of all the standard of living that we all enjoy.
Thank you.
I would like there to be much more nuanced reporting, something that James is very passionate about, and me too. When we see reporting on China, it's either, they're just caricatures. It's either our trading partner or our enemy, and they're bomb throwers, or we think that it's either, they're either going to take over the world or they're going to collapse. These are just, you know, the dumbing down I am really annoyed by. And given such a gulf of information asymmetry, so many Chinese people understand English, and so much of our world, the Western world, is open to Chinese people to understand, and then vice versa is the exact opposite. I think Peter was telling me that each year our 42 Australian universities produce only 5 honours students who are studying China in Chinese. Compare that to the people studying other countries, studying in China of the world. And we really need to step up our understanding, and especially because China hides so much. Had I not been incarcerated by the Ministry of State Security, I would never have known that these practices went on. And that's just a small example of human rights abuses. So I wish we had better reporting. I wish our diaspora was less fearful that they weren't all co-opted by the United Front or the consulate. They could be free to speak their minds, because that is the point of living in this free country. And the same for our politicians, our Australian journalists. And yes, I'll end it there.
Well, to get back to the question of the dialogue, can we really have our cake and eat it? Look, there are 2 key variables to where Australia and China end up. One is our own policy settings, and there I think if we continue to focus on our interests, defined by ourselves, and are sensible enough in the pursuit of our diplomacy, we have a reasonable prospect of being able to, as I put it at the beginning, maximize our economic opportunity and minimize our strategic risk. But the second variable, which in my view is the much more significant one, is how the US and China relationship develops, because that really sets the boundaries for the room for maneuver that Australia and China have. And if the US and China are able to arrive at a relationship which is characterized by managed strategic competition, or competition with guardrails, or there are a whole lot of other expressions that are being used, then I think the prospects for the Australia-China relationship are much more rosy. In a funny kind of way, President Trump may offer the better prospect of a managed competition between the US and China, rather than a policy framework driven by perceptions of an existential threat, which leads you in a very different direction. So, can we really have our cake and eat it? I think it's going to get a lot harder for us to do it.
More expensive, Peter?
Harder, more expensive. Maybe we can have half our cake and eat it.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up for the evening. Thanks so much to each of you in the panel for your insights, and to the audience for your attentiveness and questions. And over to you, Murray.
Thank you, Joanna. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to experience tonight's discussion. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the room who feels much more informed and somewhat enlightened on this huge subject, which obviously needs a lot more and better discussions, public and private, in the years ahead. So, although you've already done it, please join me again in thanking our esteemed panel in the traditional hearty manner. Now, one other way to tangibly thank one member of the panel anyway is to go and buy Cheng Lei's book, Quick Brown Fox. Local bookseller is up there, and I think Lei will be signing books for a while rather than drinking for half an hour or so afterwards.
Drink inside.
She can probably do both, yeah. Please send any feedback to... there we go. The easiest one's just info@brisbanedialogues.org. For now, inquiries, suggestions, offers, whatever. Hopefully, most of you have noticed by now that there's also something called Sway, which is a very clever, powerful AI-assisted one-to-one online text chat platform where you can carry on the discussion with one other person you'll be matched with who has different views on topics relevant to tonight. The QR code, which you can probably actually operate from where you're sitting, is there. You'll get another email with the link, so there's no need to do it now. But it'll be running for a week or so, and I think you'll find it very engaging and interesting, as if you were chatting to a friend that you disagreed with. I actually liken it, the AI guide, as a marriage counsellor, making impossible discussions just about possible. So the Fables Bar, which is just on the street, front street adjacent, part of this building, will be open for another hour or so, I believe. The premium ticket holders are invited to join the speakers and volunteers upstairs in the gallery bar. And I think that's about it for the formalities. Thank you, everybody, for your contribution to this discussion. Another big dialogue. Please carry it on at the bar, at home, at work, and on Sway. Safe travels and good night.